Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you today via video in Myanmar to talk about public service motivation from 1990 to today. My name is Jim Perry. I'm from Indiana University, Bloomington. It's a pleasure to be with you. I appreciate the invitations from the United Nations Development Program, both in Myanmar and the Global Center for Public Service Excellence. And it's also a pleasure to be participating in this knowledge forum on public service motivation, which is being staged by the Union Civil Service Board. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you this morning. Let's go to the first slide, or actually the second slide after the intro. I'm talking to you about something obviously important to all of you because of this focus on the Knowledge Forum on Public Service Motivation. Nation states face a fundamental challenge. That's to develop public service institutions that support economic, political, and social development. So I'm very pleased to see this initiative on the Knowledge Forum on Public Service Motivation as a way to facilitate that effort. I'm also pleased that you're talking about developing reliable, innovative, and productive public service that helps create public value, not only for the government sector, but for the nation as a whole. So this is an important initiative, and I'm pleased to be able to play a role in that initiative today. Let me talk to you very briefly about what I'd like to cover with you this morning. First of all, I want to talk about the construct public service motivation and say something about its definition and the theory foundations behind the concept and the idea of public service motivation. Secondly, I'd like to talk very quickly about the waves of research since 1990. This is something that I have been involved in for over a quarter century. And one reason why I'm with you today is because of my involvement beginning in 1990. And then finally, I want to talk about some implications for motivation and practice. And again, I can't cover any of these factors in any significant detail, but I want to give you some sense of where we started in 1990 and where we are today with respect to the research on public service motivation. So let me go to the first item on my agenda, definitions. And this is slide 4. On slide 4, I have sort of 3 definitions. The first is the definition that we developed in the 1990 article that Lois Wise and I published in Public Administration Review. And we define public service motivation as an individual's predisposition to respond to motives grounded primarily or uniquely in public institutions and organizations. If you look at the article, one of the points we make was that we had been studying motivation in the U.S. Federal Civil Service since the late 1970s, and we discovered that many of the models that we brought and many of the incentives that we studied were not particularly effective for engaging federal civil servants. So this was sort of the origins of the idea of public service motivation, looking at incentives, looking at motivations that were unique or primarily unique to public institutions and public context. Now, since the publication of that article, we've had some other ideas that have sort of developed and have developed a following. One of them is altruism. Altruism, I define here as motivation based on a consideration of another's needs rather than one's own. Often when we see discussions of altruism, one of the references is to the maternal instinct, the tendency or willingness for mothers to sacrifice themselves for their offspring or for their children, regardless of the species. And so the idea of altruism has some familiarity and some linkage to this notion of public service motivation. But it may be one extreme or one end of the sort of the public service motivation spectrum. But it's one, for instance, that economists have associated with the idea of public service motivation. And then a third idea that's become fairly popular, and again associated with the idea of public service motivation, is pro-social motivation, the desire to have a positive impact on other people, groups, and organizations. And again, this is sort of focused on helping others, whether it be a group or whether it be a society. And again, this idea is often associated with the general notion of public service motivation. Let's go to slide 5. One of the sort of similarities and the convergence across these definitions is around this emphasis on the other, or what some people refer to as other orientation. And it's represented by notions inherent in the 3 concepts on the last slide of self-sacrifice, altruism, and pro-social behavior. The other orientation in a lot of the literature is distinguished from the self-orientation. And certainly during the 1970s and 1980s, a lot of the behavioral and social science research was focused on this idea of self-interest. And an argument was often made that motivation was based largely on self-interest. One of the things we've discovered, though, since the publication of the 1990 article on public service motivation, is that there's also a strong sort of behavioral orientation to other interests, and therefore this line of research on other orientation and on others, I think, is well founded as a foundation for motivation in public service. Now, I don't have much time to spend on the theoretical foundations behind public service motivation, but let me refer to 2. In general, I would say that disciplines like psychology, social psychology, economics, sociology, all have theories that are generally consistent with and supportive of the idea of and the ideas associated with public service motivation. One of those we pointed to in the original article on public service motivation in 1990 was something called predisposition opportunity theory, developed by 2 sociologists. But the idea was that individuals are socialized and have develop certain internalized or sort of self-concepts and self-orientations, and those predispositions tend to have an influence on the motives or the incentives to which they respond, and that's the foundation for this notion of predisposition opportunity theory. Another theoretical direction, one that developed starting in the early 1970s by Edward Deci, is what's referred to as self-determination theory. And self-determination theory projects sort of a range of motivations from what Deci and Ryan refer to as amotivation, that is no motivation at all, to intrinsic motivation, which is the opposite end of amotivation, and which is basically motivation for the love of the activity and sort of inherent sort of self-direction and self-attraction to the activity itself. Along the way, there are sort of different levels of motivation in which the gradient is largely defined by what might be considered controlled to autonomous activity. 2 of the ideas that are driven to some extent extrinsically but are also consistent with the idea of sort of internalization is our identification and integrated regulation, terms that are used by Deci and Ryan. And those ideas are fully consistent with some of the logics that we associate with the idea of public service motivation. Let's go to slide 7. Now, I indicated in my preview that I was going to talk about several waves of the public service motivation research. Let me try to summarize those very briefly and quickly. First of all, wave 1, which was the period in which we were sort of focused on definition and measurement of the idea of public service motivation, or the construct of public service motivation. I sort of associate that with the period of 1990 to 1999. In 1990, we wrote the original article. In 1996, I published an article on measuring public service motivation. In 1997, I published a follow-on article. But it was essentially during this first decade, from the introduction of the idea to the presentation of a measurement scale, that we were focused almost exclusively on definition and measurement. What is public service motivation, and how would we know public service motivation when we see it? The second wave, or wave 2, is what I refer to as construct validation and diffusion. This is the period from roughly 2000 to 2010. Some people sort of put the number of countries, for instance, that are now engaged in some form of research on public service motivation as around 50 countries worldwide. Clearly, this is evidence of the idea of diffusion of the idea. For instance, there have been about roughly 40 studies done on people in the People's Republic of China on public service motivation. Definitely diffusion from an idea that started in the U.S. and that was focused on my experiences in the U.S. both as a student and as a scholar, and with public organizations and how people behaved in those organizations, ultimately to an idea that has sort of generated worldwide attention. Wave 3 I refer to as extending the research and addressing deficiencies and gaps. That essentially I pegged to 2010 when I published an article in Public Administration Review, sort of taking stock after 20 years of the research on public service motivation. And that sort of period runs from 2010 to the current period. Now, let me sort of refer to one of the deficiencies of the original research. Much of the original research in trying to define and measure the concept was what we refer to as cross-sectional research that has a variety of threats to validity. And so one of our concerns early on was not with the validity of the bivariate or multivariate research we were doing, but simply getting a handle on whether or not this construct was defensible and how the construct was measured. Today we sort of moved to new research methodologies, experimental research, longitudinal research, panel research, all intended to validate further the ideas behind public service motivation. So there's been an upgrading of the research methodologies to diminish threats to validity, and there's been also an effort to sort of fill particular gaps in the stream of research. Now, on the slide, I also note a fourth wave, which I would say that we're in the middle of or just starting, and that's applying research results, about which I will say something later. But clearly, we spent a quarter century or more than 2 decades focused on the concept, its validity, and its relationship with other variables in the motivational environment of employees, whether it be individual attributes or group attributes or organizational incentives and what have you. We've learned something about the relationship between public service motivation as an individual attribute and a variety of these other variables. Now we've gotten to the point where we can begin to think about and talk about applying the research results. So that's one of the current efforts in which we are now engaged. Let's go to slide 8. Now, how does public service motivation matter? I don't want to sort of overstate the case, but we have a lot of research that's asked the question, how does public service motivation matter? And I think it matters in a variety of respects. When we first started the research, we said it mattered with respect to who comes to government organizations or public service, the types of incentives that organizations need to provide to motivate those individuals, and also the performance of individuals in their work context. And so some of those factors have obviously carried forward in the research, but for instance, one of the things people have studied extensively is the attraction to and retention of individuals in public employment. And we know that public service makes a difference with respect to attraction and retention. We also know that public service motivation makes a difference with respect to job performance. And the question is, do we need to motivate people primarily by money, or can we get the same results in other avenues where money perhaps is less important, but the nature of the public service that one is doing is a bigger piece of the motivational framework or motivational formula? And the answer is yes, that we've got some strong research, both from economists as well as people in public administration and other fields, that indicate that job performance is also affected by public service motivation. With respect to the question of public service, one of the issues is ethical behavior. Universally, we're interested in trying to diminish corruption, which ultimately is related to people's behavior consistent with social norms, norms in the law, and sort of ethical expectations. We also know that there's a relationship between public service motivation, a positive relationship, and people's willingness to do the right thing. And so ethical behavior is also a factor that's linked to public service motivation. And then finally, civic behaviors. We have some studies that look at individuals' willingness to vote, participate in the sort of the broader political life of the state, to donate money to philanthropic enterprises, and we know that individuals who are high in public service motivation are also more likely to exhibit favorable civic behaviors. So, how does public service motivation matter? It matters with respect to attraction and retention, job performance, ethical behavior, and civic behavior. All of those are very important parts of the formula for developing a civil service that is responsive to the interests of the public and the interest of citizens. Let me say something, though, about a gap in the research, and that this involves multiple incentives, and this is slide 9. We need more research that investigates natural multi-incentive settings. A lot of the research on public service motivation has looked exclusively at public service motivation without linking it to pay and other considerations. So clearly one of the gaps that we're trying to close now, and that I think will be advantaged by this project spearheaded by the Global Center for Public Service Excellence, UNDP, is the international survey, is the idea of sort of understanding how well and how the multiple incentives fit together to generate particular behaviors across a civil service. Job security and the service ethic are central concepts in the identity of public institutions, but we need to find ways of sort of balancing the two. Clearly, one of the ideas I associate with job security, which is sort of central to a merit system, is performance. And one of the factors that is often left out of the calculus or the sort of consideration of job security is, are people accountable for their performance? In systems where people are not accountable for their performance, we're likely to get lesser quality results. But clearly, having an effective job security system together with strong public service motivation, public service ethic, I think are sort of foundations for a solid civil service, and something I would be looking for in reforming a civil service. So we need to sort out in our continuing research the joint influence of different incentives on membership, performance, and other outcomes. Let me sort of just touch very quickly on, in slide 10, on public institutional imperatives, what I consider some public institutional imperatives for the 21st century. I think public organizations, and this is part of your charge in sort of reforming the Myanmar civil service, is to reconcile what I refer to as the big three: wages, job security, and public service motivation. I think the best civil service systems are civil service systems that get the answer to the question about, what is an optimal wage, what is an appropriate job security structure and system, and what is an acceptable level of public service motivation. To answer those three questions simultaneously and successfully, and in doing so, I think that will have significant consequences for the success of the civil service system that one designs. Okay, slide 11. In concluding, I'd like to sort of refer to some lessons we're learning from the research results. I referred to Wave 4 that said applying the research. We published an article in the last month in Public Administration Review, the journal for which I'm editor-in-chief, by Rob Christensen, Lori Parlberg, and myself, that takes a look at a large number of studies that have been conducted on public service motivation since 2008. We came up with 5 conclusions about lessons from the research results that I think are important for designing into civil service systems. First of all, priority should be given to selecting for high public service motivation. Many, both developed as well as developing countries, sort of ignore the need to bring in people who have high levels of public service motivation. The focus is primarily on job performance, which is important, but sort of in the larger interests of developing effective institutions, I think attention needs to be paid to public service motivation of the staff, because that has a variety of other influences, both direct and indirect, on the success of the civil service arrangements. A second lesson from that research is to create a supportive work environment that models and reinforces public service motivation. One of the things I've learned over the years is that employees very quickly get the message of what's important in an organization. And to the extent that public service is not embraced and doesn't become part or central focus of the culture and isn't supported by the leadership as well as individuals in aligned organizations, that has significant consequences for building and growing public service motivation. So creating a supportive work environment is absolutely essential for a strong public service culture, public service ethic. A third element that we've learned, something we've learned in particular from some recent research on pro-social motivation, is the importance of leveraging employee service beneficiary ties. I tend to associate that with the distinctiveness of the public sector. Much of the work we do in the public sector comes to the public sector because private organizations can't do it because markets have failed. It may also be something that, given the coercive nature of the state, has to be associated with government and the public jurisdiction. But clearly, one of the ways of sort of enhancing an individual's significance is trying to link their service to people in the society, to their own activities, where they have a sort of a personalized relationship with the service beneficiary. That's absolutely essential and highly motivational. Again, it begins to get at the higher levels of motivation associated with self-determination theory, as well as the idea of intrinsic motivation. 2 other sort of lessons we've learned: provide opportunities for newcomers to learn public service values. We shouldn't assume that everyone knows the values that are embedded in the mission of a particular agency or a governmental structure, and so it's important to socialize individuals to these public service values. And then finally, and again, I think a sort of a core idea that's absolutely essential and consequential for the success of civil service reforms that are trying to structure a strong public service ethic, is to develop leaders who communicate and model public service values. Leaders who ignore public service values and fail to model and communicate those values will fail to bring staff along with the sort of the mission of the organization, with the importance and significance of the work they do, and with the overall sort of ethos that is we're trying to develop in a governmental context. Let me go to slide 12, the last slide. I've talked about the research. I have a sort of a fairly comprehensive bibliography on my website. It's Public Service Motivation Research Bibliography. The slide indicates the place where it can be found on the website. There are literally hundreds of studies, many of them in the non-Western world, that might be helpful to you. I certainly encourage you to look at some of that research, which is easily accessible off the website. The other thing that I'm open to is receiving emails from you. My email address is perry@indiana.edu. I'd be more than happy to get communications from any or all of you. If you all respond, just remember that it's going to take some time for me to execute the responses, but I'd certainly be happy to interact with you over the design issues you're considering in structuring your civil service systems, as well as trying to motivate individuals within your public jurisdictions. Again, my thanks to the organizers. It's a pleasure to have been here via video. I wish I could have been there in person, but I wish you success in the coming 2 days in developing an agenda to go forward with both the surveys as well as the structuring and improvement and reform of your civil service systems. Thank you.